Our guest tonight is Olivia Watkins from the Black Farmer Fund, and I'm very excited for you all to hear from her. But before I introduce her, I want to let you know that this event is hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment, and it is a collaboration with the Afro-American Cultural Center at Yale, the Yale School of Management program on social enterprise, and the program on entrepreneurship, as well as the Yale Center for Environmental Justice. My name is Tagan Engel, and I'm a resident fellow at the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And I have been invited here to do work that centers liberatory practices, specifically around food systems, racial equity, and community-directed work. So the topics that we'll be talking about tonight fit in really perfectly with that. And this webinar is connected to a discussion group that I lead called Power and Race in Community, Business, and the Environment. So today's conversation, I think it's very important that we put this in the larger context of the society that we live in and a world where profits are valued over people and the planet. And this has been really clear for centuries through practices and policies such as the genocide of indigenous peoples, enslavement of African peoples, sweatshops, land theft, and the climate crisis, among many others. Our guest today, Olivia Watkins, will be speaking about the Black Farmer Fund's pilot year and about the innovative work that they are doing to repair some of these historical harms and invest in a just food system. And we certainly celebrate Black History Month every day of the year, but it's wonderful that you're here for Black History Month and that we're addressing some of this history, but in particular that we're looking at Black futures and the way that you are doing work that is really liberatory for Black people. So in addition to some questions that I will ask, we are going to have a guest student, Lauren, from the Afro-American Cultural Center, and also welcome everyone who is listening to put your questions into the Q&A feature of the webinar, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. So, to the good stuff. Welcome, Olivia Watkins. Olivia is the co-founder and president of the Black Farmer Fund. She is a social entrepreneur and impact investor. And for the past 7 years, she has financed, developed, and operated environmental and social projects across the United States. In addition to being the president of the Black Farmer Fund, she also serves as a board member of Soul Fire Farm Institute, where I am also a board member, which is how I first met Olivia. And prior to founding the Black Farmer Fund in 2017, Olivia worked in several production roles at Soul Fire Farm Institute, as well as at Kahumana Organic Farms. Is that in Hawaii, Olivia?
Yeah.
Wonderful. She's leveraged her environmental biology background to manage and grow environmentally regenerative and socially impactful business operations. Olivia has an MBA from North Carolina State University in financial management and a BA in environmental biology from Barnard College, Columbia University. She was recognized on the 2021 Forbes list of 30 under 30 for social impact and the GRIST 50. Olivia, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's my pleasure. So we'll start off, I want to invite you to share some slides and give people an overview of the work that you are doing with the Black Farmer Fund to get us started.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and taking time out of your afternoon, evening to hear about the work that my team and I are doing. Tagan, can you see the slides?
Yep, it looks great.
All right, great. So this work really started out of a direct ask from communities of Black farmers and food businesses around creating some sort of financial vehicle that we could trust. And this is kind of built off of so many different historical statistics and stories that we've heard that have, ultimately led to a lot of distrust in the capitalist system and the current main ways that farmers, get financing, like the United States Department of Agriculture. So some of the statistics that inform our work are particularly around the decrease of Black farmers drastically over a period of time. And also to this day, some of the racial wealth gaps that we see in the food system. So in around 1920, Black farmers were, at their peak. They had several generations coming out of Emancipation Proclamation. Black farmers were purchasing land, they were becoming self-sufficient, and around 1 million Black farms were in existence in the US. But over the course of the next several decades, we started to see a really drastic decline, which kind of leads us to where we're at today, particularly in New York. Out of 57,000 farmers, only 139 are Black. And this decline is definitely very intentional, very systemically intentional, not only through farmers not being able to access financing from some of the traditional lending and granting institutions, but also neighbors just straight up harassing people, making it hard for Black farmers to thrive on their land. But, this correlates very clearly with, some of the great migration that we've seen, during this time period, and people, just literally not being able to hold on to their land to be able to create opportunities for themselves and for their families. So right now in New York State, white farmers make about $42,000 a year in net cash income, and Black farmers make about negative $906 a year. And so these statistics, as we were going on our journey, learning about, some of the issues and learning about some of the stats and, looking through research papers and kind of seeing these really jarring statistics. And then also, going through our communities, gathering in groups with folks and hearing people's stories and problems that they were having, we really saw that there was an opportunity to be able to create something that was able to address some of these wealth gap problems that we see in our community, but also to be able to collectively create a community around Black farmers and food businesses to increase the presence of them in the US. So the solution and Black Farmer Fund, we're really a part of a larger movement around food sovereignty and community governance. And for those of you who are not familiar with what food sovereignty is, it really is a term that talks about folks who are directly responsible for growing and producing food for the rest of the food system, being able to have places of power in how food gets distributed, in how wealth gets distributed within the food system, and really being able to create a system that is strengthened by people who have had land stolen, who have been enslaved to work for the food system, and who have been extracted from. So for us, we see ourselves as one really small piece of this larger puzzle, alongside many other organizations that I'll be shouting out later. And we really wanted to be a part of finding ways to move money, not only into the food system, but also to be able to bring Black farming communities into the process of moving that money. So Black Farmer Fund, to be more specific now, is a nonprofit community investment fund, which basically just means that we have the ability to offer several different financing options like grants and loans. But then we also offer a lot of programmatic support like financial education and relationship building opportunities for our farmers. So there are three main pillars of what we do, and as we go along in this slide and in the conversations that I'll be having with Tagan, I can dive more deeply into them, but investing, empowering, and organizing are really our three main focal points. So for investing, we provide integrated capital, which means that We can provide farmers grants and debt, and we've been considering in the past couple of months equity to Black farmers and Black food businesses. This for us is a really crucial part because a lot of financial institutions currently provide financial capital that is not patient, meaning that there's really not enough time that farmers can get to, either return payments, or there's a lot of pressure for farmers to expand rapidly and not extractive. So making the terms as favorable as possible to the farmer and food business. The investment criteria that we use is a really important part of this. And this is essentially what helps us build out a food system that is in alignment with the mission and vision of being able to create and participate in food sovereignty through community governance. So, the numbers that I showed in the beginning, as we work towards increasing the number of Black farmers and food businesses, we also want to make sure that the folks that we're investing in are participating in building community wealth. They have social capital in their communities. They are practicing regenerative agricultural practices. If they're not a farm, they are finding ways to mitigate their waste in a way that's sustainable. And also they're aware of and incorporating economic justice. So making sure that as they succeed, their community succeeds right along with them. And so this is like a really pivotal and key point for what, we really believe at the organization makes our work successful, is being able to either invest in farms and food businesses that are focusing on these things, or be able to provide resources and support and mentorship to farmers and food businesses who want to be able to get to this point. So here's some stats in terms of the funding activities so far that we've had. We closed on a $1 million fund last year, and since then we've been in the process of deploying about 40% of that fund. So we had about 50 applicants in the first round of our funding, and we selected 8. And about 5 of them have fully received all their funding, and 3 of them were still in the process of making sure that the terms are favorable, that we're really providing them patient, flexible capital, and that they have everything that they need outside of funding to ensure their success. So these are some terms that I will, continue to talk more about in our conversation with Tagan. What I think really, sets us apart in terms of the nitty-gritty of like how we're structuring all the legal documents and the things that get super jargony. So making sure that we have super low interest rates, we have long time frames for people, that we're willing to take different types of seniority in loans, so that way we can be flexible with people depending on where they're at. There are a lot of farmers, for instance, young farmers who have student debt, or farmers that have debt. And so oftentimes there will be other banks or institutions that are trying to hold farmers accountable, oftentimes in predatory ways. And so, we want to be able to provide them that capital, but in a way that is, very flexible. The next part of the work that we do, as well as empowerment, and this is a really huge part, and I think one of my favorite parts in terms of being able to really deepen the relationships that we have with the people that we invest in, the businesses that we support. So not only by providing technical assistance, each cohort member works with a technical assistance coach around specific areas, being able to subsidize business services. So one of our cohort members, currently we're supporting them with getting their bookkeeping services subsidized as they set that up. And really, also, one of the other pieces about the empowerment work that we do that I kind of alluded to before was community governance. So making sure that as us as a nonprofit organization goes along with making decisions, making sure that our decisions are not in isolation. So we bring in a community of Black farmers, organizers, food businesses into the decision-making process. Last year, we also had a lot of really great skill shares, and the intention of this was around being able to relationship build and network build, which is really, really key because funding is just one piece of the puzzle. We also facilitate and create opportunities for people who are in our governing bodies, people who are in our greater community, to be able to share knowledge and exchange knowledge with one another. We have farmers who are operating apple orchards, and they want to learn more about beekeeping because bees can help to ensure the success of fertilization for lots of fruit trees. And so we brought in Carmen to give knowledge and share knowledge on bees and honey. So as I mentioned, our governing body, which we actually transitioned them out of their 1.5-year long term and will be recruiting a new body that will be a more ongoing term. But this is really kind of one of the more pivotal parts of the community governance work that we do. So we have a group of really amazing organizers, farmers who came together over the course of the last year to make the investment decisions that I told you about. So not only did they use the investment criteria as their guidelines, but they also used a collective and consensus-based decision-making process. So rather than them thinking of themselves as just individual votes in a silo, they really all had to come to a shared, agreed understanding of whether or not to invest in a certain business. And that, as a result, created so much accountability across this group. And still to this day, a lot of these folks participate in many ways. So the last thing that I'll touch on before we get into questions is our organizing work. Myself and my co-founders and my board members are all involved in grassroots organizing across the food system of the Northeast. And we really thought that this was important to include in our work because, as I mentioned before, we're just one piece of the puzzle, and there's so many organizations that are working, across different niches within the food system to be able to ensure the success of food sovereignty being achieved. So we do a lot of collaboration with national organizations and policymakers, providing recommendations for policies, participating in policy convenings and advocating for Black farmers on the national, state level and regional scale. And then we also partner with a collaborative that we call the ecosystem to be able to provide a wide range of technical assistance support across farmers that we're working with. So this is the members of the ecosystem, and the ecosystem, what I really love about this collaboration is that we are, on many different levels in our organization, practicing community collaboration. So at the individual level, we're making specific individual decisions around how money is being distributed. But on a community and systemic level, we're working with Corbin Hill, Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, Soul Fire Farm, and Farm School NYC around being able to make sure that we can support one another in our different respective areas of the food system to achieve our collective goal of food sovereignty. So one example is that one of our farmers has had a relationship with Corbin Hill Food Project to distribute his produce to markets in New York. And so that's something that we continue to facilitate and make sure that we support, whether or not it's providing him funding, extra funding to increase to get a bigger truck, or funding to be able to provide him with expenses around packaging, really being in tune to the entire kind of circle of the food system and being able to respond at that. And with Farm School NYC and Soul Fire Farm, there are so many amazing farmers who are coming out of those programs who are looking for access to capital to either continue the work that they're doing on their pre-existing farms or start their own farms. And so being able to be an organization that they can depend on and they can trust for not only further technical assistance around finances, further technical assistance around technical agricultural ways of doing the work, but also to be able to trust that they can receive money from us, and we will be just as accountable to making sure that they are successful as they are accountable to us.
Absolutely. And that was a really great overview so that people can have a sense of the scope of work you're doing, as well as some of the ways that you're working that are different. So I think it's a perfect setup to inspire questions. And I actually wanted to invite you to share a little more detail about some of the ways that the fund is working. So thinking in the context that capitalism is, one of the systems that has really created a lot of the systems of oppression that you're now trying to actually repair from. I was curious if you could share a little bit more about your approach to building a solution within such a capitalist framework, and how you're breaking down some of the standard practices that an investment fund uses in the way that you are doing a community-driven or community governance process. And if you could share a little more details about how that process actually works.
Yeah, definitely. So there are a couple of points around, there's so many things. I guess what I'll start with is that when we first went about figuring out how we were going to structure the organization, we knew that we wanted to be some sort of investment fund. But as we were looking at models, we realized that a lot of models were potentially structured so that way the people who were putting in money into the investment were receiving a substantial and sizable amount of money in return. And additionally, a lot of the investment fund models were for-profit model, where the people who were, either operating or investing would essentially own whatever investments were made. And so we didn't want to do that, any of those things at all, because it can create really toxic power dynamics. And so we did a bunch of research on what are some alternative ways of creating funds that are in alignment with the values that we had. And we found an exemption in the Investment Act of 1940 that was specifically around what they call charitable loan funds. We don't see our work as charity, but it is a structure that exists within the current capitalist system that allows us to be able to effectively do our work. So we became a nonprofit, created a board, and did all of the paperwork and things associated with that. And we knew as well at the beginning that we wanted to have the community that we're investing in involved in the decision-making process, because we didn't want to just be a board or a team of 5 people who are actually executing on the decisions on behalf of a whole entire food system. That as well didn't feel great. And because a lot of our time and energy was focused on actually operating and running the fund and sustaining it, there are so many amazing people that we work with who have way deeper knowledge of the communities because they're actually on the ground. And so we really wanted to bring that internally in a way that was real. Oftentimes with investment funds, there will also be like advisory committees where committees will like advise, what they should do, but ultimately, the fund and the people who govern and run the fund had a decision-making process. So, final decision. And so what we did is that we created an investment committee. We call it our pilot community because language is really important and powerful. And we created like an addendum, like a legal document that basically said that the investment committee has final say over the board and staff, about the decision making. And like the only, way that the board and staff could veto is if, something came up where the potential investee was like being sued, or they were suing people, or they were just like being bad actors, in the community. And but that was the only kind of reason as to why, the folks who were working the organization could have say over it. So it's been a process of like basically finding opportunities to be able to put down our values on paper in like legalese. So that way it's real and not us just saying like, oh yeah, like our investment committee, like they have decision-making power until they don't. And in terms of the process, so for our pilot fund, they were not only involved in making decisions, but they also helped us design the process itself. And so the process that we did last year, which is going to be different than this coming year because iteration and innovation, was that we had an application process, and the Black Farmer Fund staff and some members from the pilot community did due diligence. We also had a contractor that we worked with, Sankofa Group, which is a Black finance firm that also supported with due diligence. And then we brought in cohort members to talk with the pilot community, basically, interviewing, relationship building. And then after that, the pilot community, we would go through each business and they had to come to a consensus. So it would be, sometimes it was a unanimous yes, sometimes it was a yes if, we see, we need to learn about X, Y, and Z, or yes if, whatever, or there were flat out no's. And so it was a constant, constantly iterative process of getting to a decision point, which I think in the long run had made such an incredible experience where the pilot community members and the decision makers were so involved and invested in the outcomes of the business in the way that was truly supportive rather than kind of helicoptery, because they were part of this broader organization where nobody has any sort of financial gain from the outcomes, and people just in the pilot community wanted everyone to do well because of the amazing social impacts that the businesses will have.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And it's really important, I think, to hear about the amount of work that it takes to put your values into practice and to actually document them so that they keep happening. But that's how we have transformative change, is by doing that work, and hopefully it will get easier each year that you do it. I would like to invite, there's some really great questions in the chat, but I first want to invite a guest question asker, Lauren Bass Sanford, who is joining us as a student assistant on the Intercultural and Social Justice Programming Team for the Afro-American Cultural Center. And Lauren is a junior, and they are double majoring in ethnicity, race, and migration, as well as music. And Lauren, I'm really happy that you're here and want to invite you to ask your first question that you had.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's been really great to hear all about the Black Farmers Fund, Olivia, so thank you so much. My question, one of my first questions was that I was wondering if you could talk more about why, a thought behind doing more than just funding, or basically why just providing funding is not enough. And I was thinking about this, more generally in terms of, discourse about like reparations and things like that, and how oftentimes that kind of stuff is thought of like, oh, there's money lost, or like those any sort of reparations, whatever, should come in the form of money. But there's so much more that would need to happen. It seems like, and it seems like that's what's coming from like the other initiatives in the Black Farmers Fund. So I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the either historical or contemporary reasons why like just doing funding is not enough, and why Black Farmers Fund is trying to go beyond that.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for your question. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being here. Yeah, I think for every geography, it's so different. Every geography has a different kind of answer to that question. And with Black Farmer Fund, we focused this last round of funding in New York, and we're slowly considering expanding throughout the Northeast. So, I'm going to mainly focus my answer on that geographic region, because the South and Black farmers in the South deal with completely different issues that I'm not involved in. So for the Northeast, especially, the simplest way to answer your question of why funding isn't enough is because a lot of Black farmers in the Northeast live in isolation, and not only social isolation, but also economic isolation. So a lot of the farms that I know of are the only Black farm in their county. And so especially when you get to more rural areas of New York, where the access to some of the major city markets are not as easy to access, it is just generally harder for Black farmers to enter into some of their local and regional markets that may not necessarily that may be racist, and may not necessarily may be intimidating to enter into because of being the only Black farmer in that space. And so I think that economic isolation makes it harder for Black farmers, once they're up and running, to be able to even sell their product. So, for us, we knew that we wanted to, yes, invest in farmers, but also we knew that we needed to invest in other markets in the food system that would be able to interact with the farmers that we're working with. And there are so many different like historical anecdotes around the isolation that exists, but I think what we've experienced with our farmers is that our farmers oftentimes the land in more rural areas will be cheaper to be able to afford, whether or not it's either purchasing the land or leasing the land. And so our farmers are already coming in, with less money to be able to invest in markets that may be closer to their communities. And so they have to put their land further out from their communities. So we have one farmer that we work with where the land that they're currently leasing is like a 2-hour drive from most of where they distribute their product. And, so there's also some of the real estate kind of macroeconomic conditions that, have placed people who have already been extracted from at a disadvantage of being able to access land and resources, closer to markets that they that might be interested in doing business with them, or, exchanging goods and services with them.
Thank you. There's obviously a lot more to that question as well, just in terms of all of the societal, all of the inequities that exist. But I want to move on to some additional really good questions that are coming up. Leah Penniman of Soulfire Farm put a question in the chat about, she said, thank you for sharing such a beautiful summary of the Black Farmer Fund. How do you handle default and collateral? Curious to understand more about how patient capital works. And also she asks, which funds inspire you and are informing your model?
Yeah. Hi, Leah. Thanks for your question. Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't had any defaults yet. We are basically doing a couple different things. We're inputting, a certain level that we expect to have defaults, which are, very natural to any sort of investment fund. So within our modeling, we are anticipating around 20% of our loans to default. And so what this allows us to do is essentially create things like a loan loss reserve. So that way, in case of defaults, we'll be able to not only, pay back our investors a percentage, but then also we'll be able to have, money for our farmers in case they do default and are in the red, to be able to support them with, whatever they need in the meantime. Having a default is not necessarily like the end of the relationship. It's definitely a continuation of, examining, all right, what went wrong and how can we continue to support you. In terms of collateral, for each business, it's completely different. We approach, and so when we initially started this work, we were like, we're not going to take collateral because we don't, want to be extractive. And if somebody, defaults, then we're going to, seize their property or whatever. That was just not something that we were about. But what we noticed as we were talking to more funds, and as we were dealing with farmers who were working with creditors that did have claims on their collateral. And so for anybody who doesn't know what collateral is basically in a loan agreement or in a financial agreement. A bank can say, all right, if this loan fails, and you won't be able to pay us back, you can pay us back by giving us your tractor or by giving us the deed to your house. And that is the way that you'll pay us back and you'll be free and clear. Which can be really extractive and has happened so many times, over history, countless times over history, where people will get their homes taken from them. And so for us, we started to see that a lot of other funds that were aligned with us, and also particular situations where folks did have creditors, it's actually in many ways an advantage to be a senior creditor, which basically entitles you to have access to collateral. And the reason why is because if we, make an investment with a farmer, they're doing well, and then someone comes along with other money, which is always great for them to be able to access other sources of funding, but then wants to, have access to their collateral, they might not necessarily be as nice and forgiving and as empathic as we are. And so if we essentially protect their collateral from any other future investors, especially if people are thinking of accessing funds from future investors, then that completely eliminates the opportunity of someone being extracted from in that way. So with some of the businesses where they do have plans to seek other investment, then we will, if they don't have creditors already, do take a senior creditor position for the purpose of being able to protect their assets from other investors who may not necessarily be aligned like us in the future. So it's been really interesting because when I came into this work, I was like, we're not taking collateral, like we're not doing any of those things, but it's been interesting being able to like rework the way that my mind thought, because as someone who is a part of an institution that is giving money out into, our communities, there are certain, legal ways of codifying relationships that exist that, have typically not been used in the favor of our farmers. And so are there ways for us to be able to turn those relationships around and be able to help our farmers protect their assets? So in terms of the language around that and how we will deal with, basically forgiving loans, not taking people's collateral, all that stuff is codified in like the loan agreements that we do. In terms of like other aspects of patient capital, creating loan terms that are either seasonal or that are based off of percentages of profits means that a farmer won't have to consistently pay back the principal or the interest, even when they have winter months where they are not making any money. So a lot of our loans are seasonal because of that.
So by seasonal, you mean that people would pay during the growing season, but then in the winter season, when they don't have income coming in, they wouldn't have to pay.
Yeah, they wouldn't have to pay, or they would pay less, things like that. And then also, a big part of having patient capital, being able to do patient capital, means that we have patient investors. So the investors that we work with, we only work with investors that are going to allow us to determine what the terms are. So for instance, we work with a really, really great investor right now called Sandy River Charitable Foundation. And they've given us a 10-year investment at 0.5%, which basically means that in 10 years, we'll need to return their money to them with only 0.5% interest, which, if you know anything about loans or mortgages, 0.5% is basically unheard of. And so that enables us to be able to continue to offer lower rates and flexible terms, because we have flexible investors who are mission aligned and who get and understand the work that we're doing. So that is, really like at the crux of patient capital, is working with very patient investors.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, you're called the Black Farmer Fund, but you're not only investing in farmers, you're also investing in other food entrepreneurs that are doing things like CBD products, preserving a collective of people, preserving food, and kind of touching on entrepreneurs in other parts of the food system. And I'd love if you can explain why you made the decision not to just invest in farmers, and why you're looking at the entire food system and what's important about that.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to kind of piggybacking off of what I said to Lauren earlier, because our farmers are oftentimes in economic isolation and don't have access to some of the most popular markets, whether or not that's like geographical markets like major cities, or some of the biggest the biggest wholesaler distributors, or they can't get a slot into a farmer's market in their local area because it's already full and super popular and really exclusive. By investing in other market makers, we can be able to create business-to-business connections. So, we have chefs that, we have one chef that's in our pilot community, and she works with a lot of our farmers to be able to source product from our farmers. And so last season, she bought out one of our cohort members' entire source of turkeys to be able to distribute into Brooklyn, communities in Brooklyn. And so it's opportunities like that, that we recognize that, non-farmers are also just as important to the food system and are also struggling with, some of the racial wealth gap disparities, and like finding their own markets and finding their own, suppliers. And so we knew that we needed to be able to be more inclusive in the way that we were investing and make relationships with folks, so that way everybody can build together. Yeah,
thank you. There are a number of questions about the fund, technical questions, but before we get to those, and we only have about 10 minutes left, so maybe we could try to have short answers. I think we need another half hour.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I think we should have scheduled for a lot more time, but Lauren, I want to invite you in to ask your question about kind of the role of government, because I thought that was a important question.
Yeah, for that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the reasons you founded the Black Farmer Fund, because I was wondering, it seems like it's an effort to take matters into your own hands in the face of a government capitalist system that's not doing enough or that's maybe failing. And so I was just wondering if that was part of the thought you were having when creating this organization, and what you think the role of the government should be in supporting Black farmers and alleviating historical and contemporary inequalities.
Yeah, definitely. That was definitely a part of it as well, because we had seen over the past several decades documentation and proof of United States Department of Agriculture, which is an arm of the government that supports farmers not only with money but also with policy. That they were like consistently failing to support Black farmers across the board, but especially in financing. And there was a really big lawsuit called Pickford v. Glickman that was like a culmination of literally decades of things that had happened, and even stuff had happened before Pickford and Glickman around intentional racism. But what was basically happening was that a lot of the like regional committees, there are a lot of the regional committees that make a lot of the decisions around, who gets access to funding, were denying people loans or, losing their loan applications, things like that. And the regional committees were not they were not diverse at all. And so, the USDA has recently created an equity committee that that's put together so many really great people and elders who have been doing this work for a long time to be able to, hopefully address like some of the issues that have been happening for like a century. And at the same time, that is a very long process that's going to take multiple years. The government moves very slowly because there's so many different steps and so many different voices in making sure that certain priorities are prioritized. The other way that the government typically supports farmers is the Farm Bill, and I'll try to keep it short, but the Farm Bill is one of the ways that a lot of farmers get access to money. And there are so many different hands in that process as well. And so we needed a solution like yesterday, and so I think that was one of the kind of key things is, while the government is working on, supposedly trying to right their wrongs, like in the meantime, let's work to create something that can move quicker.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. There are some very specific questions that I just want to get to. One is about, is the Black Farmer Fund investing in farms in urban environments and urban communities, or just primarily in rural communities?
Yeah, we do not discriminate in terms of urban, rural. We currently in our current pool only have one person who has a community garden that's in a more urban area. But most of the farmers that we're working with right now are rural.
Thank you. And there are some questions about if you're able to give grants to other nonprofits, like in terms of the IRS, the way the IRS categorizes you. And I forget what you said, if you're classified as a public charity or how you're actually giving grants, if you can give grants to businesses, not just to other nonprofits.
Yeah, focus our grant making on businesses. And so there are a couple of like procedures that you can do in order to demonstrate to the IRS that this is a charitable grant to a for-profit business, and it aligns with the charitable mission of our organization to make it essentially in compliance with some of the IRS. But we are registered as a 501c3 public supported nonprofit organization.
Great. Thank you. Sort of piggybacking on the answer that you gave to Lauren's question about the role of government, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the organizing work that you're doing with your cohort in terms of, and with like the partners that you're involved in terms of either working on the Farm Bill or other organizational systemic change that you're trying to advocate on, and how you're doing that with your cohort.
Yeah, so particularly for government work? Yeah.
Any of the work
Okay.
that's creating supports for Black farmers and food entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so the work with the ecosystem mainly has been focusing on being able to support farmers with individual farmers with services that they need. We do show up to state hearings together, and a lot of the ecosystem members are a part of Black Farmers United New York State, which is a organization that was created specifically to lobby and advocate for Black farmers in the New York State government. And so we will, show up to hearings and advocate and, share some of the information that we know and the anecdotes and things like that. We'll meet, with different staffers and representatives around our issues as well. But particularly with the ecosystem work, there's an example that I have of where one of our cohort members has received support, technical assistance support and access with finding land from Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And so then we were able to then come in and provide that organization with access to funding. And they're also working with Corbin Hill Food Project on being able to figure out how to be more efficient with their food distribution.
Mm-hmm. And what is Corbin Hill doing? Are they helping to actually distribute their food out into communities?
Yeah, so for some of the farmers, they do that directly. But, mentorship and learning is a really, really huge part. So they've had conversations with Corbin Hill around, how they can create some of their own food distribution. Mm-hmm. And that's, in alignment with some of the ways that Corbin Hill has done it. Yeah,
it's such an important part. I think the way of working with partners, because there's so many needs and you can't possibly fill all of them. And so I think it's such an important part of transformative justice work to actually figure out what you can do and then find the partners that do the other part, whether it's the policy change or the other supports that are needed. So I love that you're illustrating that in the way that you're working. There's a couple of other specific questions around, do you know about any work that's happening around similar lines in the South?
Yes, so there's an organization or a fund called Pot Liquor Capital, and they're focused nationally. Mark Watson, who's the founder of that organization, actually was a really pivotal part of building out our portfolio management, our investment strategy, things like that. And so, they have really focused on building out an organization that could serve farmers nationally. And they are working with a farmer right now in Louisiana, and they have a couple of other farmers that they're working with in the South as well. But yes, they're a fund that's doing really amazing work, and that's in alignment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'm going to try to squeeze in two quick questions.
Okay.
One, and this might be too complex, but it's actually from Leah again, but is a pretty important question about how do you legally protect yourself from accusations of reverse racism in lending? And noting that the recent debt relief for Black farmers is stalled in court, which is infuriating given how much work people are doing to move that forward.
Yeah, it's definitely annoying because, Cory Booker and some of the other senators have worked really hard on that with recommendations from, organizations like Soulfire and National Black Food and Justice Alliance. So, but in the meantime, we're still working on trying to get money out the door, through our organization. And in terms of reverse racism, there are so many different ways to like legally codify that what we're doing isn't in fact reverse racism, is not in fact reverse racism. And, that is, in everything from our IRS applications, showing that we're basically creating the links and showing that this is in fact, this is charitable work, right? And so that kind of allows us to continue to exist because we're basing our work off of an assumption that there's a gap that needs to be, met. And obviously it's so much more than that. But that is how we can legally protect ourselves because we are operating, out of focusing on creating social good, which is, what we really do. I mean, funding, is one part. We're not in it to, create massive amounts of money for the organization. We're really interested in creating massive amounts of money for our community. And so, codifying it in all the different legal documents around the social good piece is a way that we are able to legally protect ourselves.
Yeah, that's so important that the mission and that the way that your 501c3 is defined actually covers all of the actions you're taking so that you can point back to that. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. And I guess another very important question is how can people support and help your work? There was a specific question in the Q&A about how can corporations help, but I think it would be great to share how can all different kinds of folks help?
Yeah, I'm realizing now I didn't put up a slide of our email address and
I'll put it in the Q&A.
But yeah, I think, we really look to our community, our broader community outside of farmers and food businesses to continue to advocate for the work that we're doing, across the food movement. So really being advocates for the importance of food sovereignty, buying from Black farmers, volunteering on Black farmers' land, helping, food businesses, volunteering, with them and providing them support, going to hearings, like really being an active participant. There's been so much media coverage lately on, the work that a lot of organizations have been doing around the Justice for Black Farmers Act, and continuing to amplify the work, I think is, the most important thing. So we are, in terms of what our next year is going to look like, we're, pretty much going into a phase where we're building out our investment committee again and continuing to deploy funds, but also raising more funds to continue to expand our work in the Northeast. And so the more people that share about the work that we do and the work that others in the movement do, the easier it is for us to be able to explain to people why this work is important.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. I wish we had a lot more time to talk, but I'm so grateful for everything you shared, and I really encourage people to go to the Black Farmer Fund website. There's great profiles on each of the people they are supporting this year. We didn't get to talk in a lot of detail, but you can see a lot more about those businesses and learn more about the funding model and definitely spread the word. So Olivia, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And yes, I could talk for days about this. So perhaps we'll do this another time.
That would be great. And Lauren, thank you for asking your questions, and to all of our collaborators and for everyone for taking the time to join tonight. Really appreciate it. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.